you will have received your APT in the middle of December and should be working through it now, but this is a session to support you in completing that in time for the required date of 22nd of January to return it. We have produced guidance on how to download and return your APT, and indeed how to complete the APT, and a specification on what the school's block dataset calculations are based on. Okay, now these slides will be circulated, as Busher has mentioned, after the session. So the links to those documents will be in these slides. So don't feel the need to have to jot all this down now. The session itself will highlight some of the reasons why local authorities sometimes are asked to resubmit an APT, because it's got a couple of things wrong with it, either in terms of a compliance or there's a break in the formula or something after it's been worked on. So we'll go through some of those reasons, and it also gives you the chance to raise issues that you're having, and colleagues that are on the line now will be able to hopefully offer a resolution to those. We may need to take the occasional one offline. So if you want to put a question in the chat, then please do so. But after we've run through these slides, there will be a Q&A session after that. The idea is that some time spent now talking through any issues that you've got, that a scenario you've not come across before, something like that. If we talk through it now and support that resolution in advance, then it reduces the turnaround time later, because we have fewer resubmissions to work through from both sides. There are 30 checks that ESFA colleagues will do in terms of whether the APT complies with the regulations, and there's 15 checks that we do to check that what has been done is what we class as reasonable. And in the APT, before you submit it, there are 58 validation checks in the APT itself. And so this session will go through some of the common failures. So some of them are the simple validation checks. So on the validation sheet of your APT on the right hand side, there's all of the checks in there are listed, and if there's some red flags there, then you need to attend to those before you submit your APT. And we'll cover some of those or how to deal with those shortly. A main area of focus will be on the inputs and adjustments tab. Our most common entry in there is around how you adjust the funded pupil number away from the lagged census if it is felt and agreed that the lagged census is not an appropriate number to fund schools on. And there's particular focus on any new free schools that you may have that you will need to include in your modelling. There's a couple of areas on the local factors tab, particularly around new and growing schools, around entering the high needs pupil numbers where there is a high needs unit in a school or academy, and also on national non-domestic rates, or NNDR. So we'll look through those. Then there's the recoupment tab towards the end of the APT, and particularly the growth payments element on there. And finally, we'll give a quick reminder on expectations around political ratification dates. Okay, so we'll go through those areas. Just to cover a couple of new areas this year, a few local authorities amended funding slightly to account for reception uplift. That is no longer a facility in the APT, in the funding formula. The NFF has now removed that facility. The columns are still there in the APT, but you can't impact your funding allocations with the reception uplift this year. That facility has been removed. And the MFG has been adjusted, the calculation to calculate the minimum funding guarantee has been adjusted to remove split site and PFI values from each side of the calculation. And that is the year specific value from each side of the equation. Okay, so values for split site and PFI in the baseline are removed using the 24-25 values, and then in the 25-26 values are removed from the 25-26 side, so that it's a like-for-like comparable approach. So those are the areas that are new for this year. Previous changes that happened in the last couple of years, split sites are now part of the NFF rather than LAs having their own approach, and their own unit cost, essentially. It is now funded through the NFF. So schools that have had split sites approved are listed in your APT. You are able to add additional split sites if the situation has arisen, but you do need our permission, and because we will confirm the distance between the sites as required for the calculation, and indeed whether the sites meet the criteria of a split site. So you can add them, but you will need our permission to do so through a disapplication. The growth and falling roles criteria, the minimum expectation is £1,570 per pupil, adjusted for your ACA. You can use a lump sum approach for growth payments for basic need. It would need to be the equivalent of £1,570 per pupil. So if you said you would fund £50,000 for every additional class, then 30 lots of £1,570 is less than 50,000. So 50,000 as a lump sum is appropriate. The 5 local authorities clusters in the London Fringe only use a single value of the London Fringe now, and that's pre-populated in the proforma, which means local authorities do not need to make a long list of inputs and adjustments entries for all those with a different London Fringe value. And in fact, the APT will not account for them if you do make that change. So if you are one of the 5 LAs in the London Fringe, just bear that in mind. And the notional SEND top-up, the expectation now is that the top-up is at least £1,800 per pupil. That is shown on the APT. So as you put the notional SEND percentages into the proforma, there is a cell on the proforma that shows what that is generating as an amount per pupil, and that needs to be over £1,800 this year, or this time around. So how to get the APT back to us when you've finished? Please don't email it. Please use the digital form that you downloaded the APT from. So it's the same link. The link was issued in an email on the 17th of December. So you click on the link in that email, that will take you to the form. If you've downloaded the form already, then your access will continue. And this time, after you've logged in and chosen that form, you will then choose the second option to upload your APT and work through the process. Please don't embed files in the APT. That was a mechanism that you could provide school forum papers and examples of other calculations that you've done. Please don't embed those files anymore, but you can upload them to that digital form after you've uploaded the APT. So you upload the APT, and then the next page, you can say that you would like to upload some additional files. So you can upload them there, and we will get them through with the APT at that point. Okay. So they could be PDFs of school forum papers, for example, or they might be some modelling that you've done for an extensive number of pupils, number changes for quite a few schools. So you might want to show the modelling that you've done there. That's all fine. We'd encourage you to do that, but don't embed them in the APT. Keep them as a separate file and you upload them through the digital form. Just to note that the digital form has had an upgrade in the virus software that is used. So we are aware that last year there were a few LAs experiencing some timeout issues, but we have been assured by our digital colleagues that the virus checking software upgrade means that that should be much fewer and further between. You may still get a timeout or a message saying that it has found a virus the first time you try it. Please do try and upload again. It should come through. We appreciate that towards deadline day, there'll be quite a few LAs trying to do the same thing, but we have been assured that the timeout issues should be much less likely than in previous years. So moving on to some of the common areas that you will need to make entries into the inputs and adjustments, and occasionally where LAs have run into some difficulties in doing that correctly. We ask you to list any school that became an academy since the October 2024 census. So any school that converted in November, in December, or in January. We do not need you to resubmit to reflect schools that converted in February. Okay, so we only need you to list those in November, December, and January. Okay, but please do that. Please make sure that you use the updated URN and LA establishment number on the inputs and adjustments tab. You can put the predecessor number in on the LAS for the LAS tab on the inputs and adjustments tab, but have a look on get information about schools, and that will list both the URN and the LAS tab for the new school, and you will clearly know the LAS tab for the predecessor. You would also list where schools have amalgamated or de-amalgamated, or indeed have closed since the October census. That is rare that a school will close mid-year, but occasionally it has happened. If it has closed or is going to close before the start of the financial year, then you can list it on the inputs and adjustments. Just pick the appropriate category in the very first column on that tab. Please make sure that you've got all of the schools you want on the inputs and adjustments tab before you go any further. Adding further schools onto the inputs and adjustments does risk the order of the providers changing in subsequent sheets of school level data. Okay, not all the changes amend the order, but the occasional change will do. So do make sure that you've got all the changes that you need listed on the inputs and adjustments before you go too much further. Do check that when you have made those entries on the inputs and adjustments, have a look on the adjusted factors sheet for that school to see if the pupil factors are still pulling through. If they are not, then please do copy and paste them into the inputs and adjustments from the schools block. But if they are pulling through, you don't need to put them through again. Okay, so just do a quick check of that, and if the school has got the factors pulling through on the adjusted factors, so they're not all zeros, then you don't need to input them on the inputs and adjustments again. The other most common changes are changing the number of pupils that you wish the school to be funded for the forthcoming financial year. Occasionally, that's to correct a census error in terms of a secondary age pupil is listed in a primary school or vice versa. Those you can simply move those across so that the primary school has only got primary age pupils, and a secondary school pupil in a primary school, you can move those across as well. But there are other reasons that you may want to change the funded pupil number. If the school already exists on the school's block data, then we're classing them as an existing provider, and you change the pupil numbers on the inputs and adjustments. It may, most commonly, it is due to a structural change. So perhaps you have an area of the authority that has lower, middle and upper schools, and you're moving those into a primary and secondary setup. That is one reason. Or the school is growing either into new year groups, so it may be a free school that opened in the last 3 years and still has year groups to be added, or indeed there has been growth in the area and you need the school or you have agreed with the school to take more pupils on, and therefore you need to increase the number of pupils that they are funded for because the lag census is not appropriate. In most cases, such changes are from September, which is partway through your financial year, and therefore you should only fund the extra pupils for the proportion of the year that they are going to be at the school. So usually that's September. So in most cases, that additional funding will be for 7/12 of the financial year. Now, for a new and growing school, you may need to apportion 5/12 of the existing year groups, 7/12 of the additional year group. Okay, so do have a think about what is happening at that particular school. Are all the year groups populated and just more pupils are joining the youngest year group and the remainder, the lag position is fine for everybody else? Or have you got a school that's growing into year groups, and so the oldest year group will need changing as well? And in fact, you need to pay on 5/12 on the old year group population and then 7/12 across the board on the new year group population. Have you an agreement that you've guaranteed certain year groups to ensure that the school is viable in its early stages of existence? So you may have an agreement with for example, a free school that's opened in the last couple of 3 years, that you have guaranteed pupil numbers for a period of time. Do you need to reflect that guarantee in the first 5 months, the period April to August? Okay, so have a think about the situation for each school in terms of what is happening, why the growth is there, and have you any guarantees arranged with that school about the number of pupils that they will have for a certain period of time. When you're making changes to pupil numbers, we'd recommend that your starting point is always a reference to the school's block data, because that will almost always be your starting point. So use a formula to bring the school's block data in, and then make the adjustment for 5/12 and then 7/12 for the additional year group or the different year group. So you can see there's 2 examples there for a primary school under the first bullet point, where we talk about the reception will be the current reception on the school's block data for 5 months, and then it will be 30 pupils for 7 months. Because it's growing into its year groups, the year 1 to 6 number will be the current school's block data for a whole year plus reception coming in. Now, that's not always the case for all primaries. So as I said on the previous slide, have a think about what's happening at that school. Is it growing into year groups? Are year groups moving on all the way through, or something slightly different? Certainly also columns R, S, V, W, and X, which are the ones highlighted in yellow here. You may want to use a formula for those, because it means that if you then get some information that means that the individual year groups change, you don't need to recalculate everything for all the subtotal groups, if you like. So you know that the number enrolling Key Stage 4 is the total of Y10 plus Y11. So if you set that up in the first place, then you only need to change the numbers in Y11 or Y10, because Key Stage 4 will update, the secondary number will update, and the total will update automatically. Okay, using formula actually is easier for us to check how you've arrived at the numbers you have, and I'll cover in a second why that is important. Please note also that irrespective of the phase of the school or academy you are changing the number for, you need to populate all of columns R to AC. So all of the numbers on the screen at the minute, from the number on roll on the left-hand side through to number on roll in Y11, please make sure they're populated, even if it is with a 0. Okay. So that's what it might then look like. You'll note that the second row has got half pupils in it. That is a factor with the fact that we've got financial years and academic years that aren't aligned in the maintained sector, and so LA's fund for part of one academic year and part of another. It is perfectly reasonable for you to fund a half pupil through the financial year. Okay, we do not require you to round up the pupil number. Okay, it is a 5 months of one part of the year and 7/12 of another. If that makes a half pupil, that makes a half pupil. That's absolutely fine. There is no requirement for you to round up from our point of view. Okay, so that's the schools that already exist, already operate, and have data generated from the October 2024 census. Column BJ, towards the end of the inputs and adjustments, is a commentary column that we ask you to populate with a description of what you have done. This helps us ensure that what you have done mathematically then matches what you're describing your intent for the year. So if you say you are adding 30 pupils for 7/12 of the year, we would expect that that pupil number has gone up by 17.5 pupils in terms of the financial year allocation, because that 17.5 is 7/12 of 30. If that comment doesn't match what you have done in terms of the calculations, then we will come back to you, because we need you to confirm which is correct. We will not make that decision for you. It is not our decision to choose which one you meant. So we will come back to you and ask you to clarify by changing either the calculations or the commentary, depending on which one you meant to do. Okay, so there's a couple of examples there of what we'd expect the numbers to show and what the commentary would show. So please do make that commentary clear and is specific to the school in question. So the two rows towards the bottom there, a new school with 120 pupils in Y7, that is fine, but make sure that the 120 is right for that school and it isn't another school that's got 90. So that penultimate row wouldn't be correct, because what you've put further across is 90 pupils. So we would say, well, hang on, you're saying the academic year is 90, but you're saying 120. So which is it? Okay, so please do make sure that everything lines up, both in terms of calculations and the commentary. If you're having to make changes for more than one time period, please do put yes in column BL. It's pretty rare that you do this, but occasionally, if you have guaranteed a level of funding for the year, you would need to uplift the October 24 census for the period from April to August, and then add the new class on after that. If you're doing that, the APT can't calculate what the academic year number would be. It would need a lot more columns, and the APT is a significant enough product as it is. So what we ask you to do is that if you are making changes for 2 time periods away from the October census, then put a yes in column BL. It allows us to isolate those and make sure that we calculate the funded pupil number for an academy for the academic year accurately to reflect what you want us to fund them for. Okay. Columns BN, BO, and BP are additional columns that we ask you to put what you expect the academic year pupil number on roll to be. Okay, so show that academic year number, both in terms of a total and then split by primary and secondary. Again, unless you're making changes to an all through school, you'll only fill out columns for 2 of those 3. But this allows us to check that what you have done is matching up with what you've described and how the calculations work. And if you have made wholesale changes, so there's a lot of schools with a lot of changes to the number on roll, then please do submit the file that you've done that's probably separate. You've probably run those calculations already in a separate file. Please do submit that as well. We're more than happy to take that example of your modelling, because that will help us break it down to understand where you've got your numbers from, and then we can proceed hopefully to clear it, because we've got the full story of your calculations. All of this then allows us to calculate the GAG allocation for academies, which is based on the academic year. So if they have a part year change from your point of view, we have then carried it forward correctly for the academic year. So that was for schools that already exist. For brand new provisions, so schools that have not yet opened. Okay, so we're talking predominantly free schools here. They're usually going to open in September. That means that the whole of their allocation should reflect a part year funding calculation. Okay, so for the existing providers, the only bit that needs to change is the pupil-led element. But for a school opening for the first time, partway through the financial year, much more of the allocation needs to be adjusted for that part year amount. And that is the lump sum and now split site funding as well. Okay, so in that case, you complete the inputs and adjustments worksheet with the actual expected pupil number, not a prorated number. So if you're expecting a free school to open with 60 pupils in it, it's 2 class FTE in the first year, and it's going to have 60 pupils. You would put 60 pupils in the inputs and adjustments, okay? And then complete the pupil-led factors data as well. Remember to flag whether these numbers are guaranteed. So column BI requires a yes or a no. And again, explain in the commentary. But then the extra step is using the opening closing column which is column O on the next worksheet, the local factors sheet. Okay, and you put in there as a formula how many months out of 12 that school is going to be open for. So most common, that will be 7/12 of the year. So you would put equals 7/12. If you put the 0.58 that's shown there, then you aren't quite right, because 7/12 is actually 0.583 recurring. So using 7/12 is more accurate and more appropriate. Okay, so this will adjust all pupil-led elements and the lump sum, and in fact split site as well. I will adjust that slide before we send it out. The split site funding is also now apportioned automatically. If you do it the way I described previously for the existing schools, then the lump sum and split site funding would not be apportioned properly. It would be allocated for the full year, which means you'd be over allocating, because the school is only open for part of the year, so it should only get a lump sum that is appropriate for that part of the year that it's open. Okay, so just bear that one in mind. New and growing schools. These are schools that have opened without a predecessor in the last 7 years. So any school that has become an academy in the last 7 years, that does not allow it to become eligible to be classed as new and growing. Okay, so it must have opened without a predecessor in the last 7 years, and it has some empty year groups, i.e. pupils are moving through the year groups, but they are not fully populated. A secondary school that has helped out with pressure in the primary phase in terms of places. If that secondary school was previously open for more than 7 years, it is not new and growing. If you have an infant school that similarly has been open for a very long time, but has recently expanded its age range to take on pupils in Key Stage 2 because of pressure in the primary place area for your authority, if that infant school had been open for more than 7 years, it's not new and growing. Okay. Similarly, you may have a free school that's opened within the last 7 years, but it has already took on pupils in all year groups. It is not new and growing because it has pupils in every year group. Okay, so both categories must be fulfilled, and it is around the fact that the school mustn't have a predecessor and must have year groups that have not been populated as yet. Okay, again on local factors, this time column P, you choose yes or no. It's pre-populated with no, so you would only need to change the yeses. And on the schools block data this year, we have added a flag of the yes and no's of who we think are new and growing. We will check if you have any different to that. That is not to say we will reject it. We will ask you, are you absolutely happy with that? And if you say yes, then we will accept it. We will check the census data and may point out that, you know, the school has been open for longer than 7 years, or it's got your pupils in all year groups. But do have a look at the schools block data. There is a column there that gives you an indicator. So what this does is ensure that the provider is not affected by the proportion that the lump sum takes up as a total of the overall GAG. So in the first year of a new free school, the lump sum is going to form a large part of their allocation. So it protects against that, while that proportion reduces as the number of pupils increases year on year. So if you have a new and growing school and you haven't flagged it, when we point out, if we have to point out that it is a new and growing school and you have to change the flag, it may be that any gains that the school has seen will now be incorporated. So you may need to adjust your formula to ensure it remains affordable. If you've shown a school as new and growing and it isn't, then you will have over allocated, and therefore we will then ask you to change the new and growing flag, and then it will apply, take the new and growing flag off, sorry. That will then apply the cap and scale, and therefore you may then have further money to allocate. Okay, so that's the impact of that flag, but just bear in mind the criteria in the first instance. The next section on the local factors tab is around high needs pupil numbers, and these are shown in columns Q to V of the local factors tab. We do not use these to calculate how many places we are going to fund, but we use this to calculate how many places are occupied and unoccupied. And of course, they have different funding rates. They have a rate of £6,000 and £10,000 respectively. So we need you to populate those columns for schools and academies that have a high needs unit. It is not for how many pupils have an EHCP at the school. If there isn't a unit, you do not need to complete this section. Okay, so the first column asks you if there is a high needs unit. If you say yes for that school, then subsequent cells in that row up to column V will look to open up and allow you to type data into it. We need the number of pupils who are attracting high needs funding as listed in the October 2024 census. Okay, so the total is the total number of places approved. That's column R. Then columns S, T, and U are how many pupils are in the unit on the October 24 census in primary Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 respectively. If the number of pupils that you enter in columns S, T, and U are less than the agreed places, then the difference is assumed to be unoccupied places. So from the table at the bottom of the slide, we have 3 schools. All 3 of them have 30 places agreed in advance. The first school has 25 pupils listed on the APT across those 3 columns. And so we will assume that 25 of the 30 places are occupied. We will pay those at £6,000 per pupil to the academy and deduct the same from your DSG. The remaining 5 places we will assume are unoccupied, and we will calculate that as £10,000 for each of those places and allocate that to the academy and deduct that from your DSG. So school A would receive in total £200,000 and the LA's DSG would be deducted by the same value. School B, again, 30 places, and the LA has put 30 pupils across the 3 key stages for that school in the APT. We will take that as all 30 places are occupied, and therefore they will all be funded at £6,000 each, meaning an allocation to the academy and a deduction from the LA's DSG of £180,000. School C, the LA put 32 pupils in the APT across the primary Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 columns on the local factors tab. We assume, again, that all 30 places are occupied. So we will pay the academy and deduct from the LA's DSG 30 lots of £6,000. So again, it's £180,000. Those other 2 pupils are funded in full by the local authority. Okay. So do make sure that those columns are completed as accurately as you possibly can. And that is how we use that data. We do not use the data to amend the total number of places. The total number of places has already been confirmed, and the outcomes of the changes that you may have submitted in the autumn term is going to be published before the end of the month. So those are the places that will be used. What this data does is describe how many are occupied and unoccupied, and then attracts the 6,000 or 10,000 place rate for which we will pay the academy and deduct you from your DSG. Okay. Also on the local factors is split sites, and that is based on information that we initially collected from local authorities as part of the 2023-2024 APT exercise, and has been updated through last year's exercise and any submissions before the summer of 2024. We have had some inquiries from a few local authorities saying, well, I can now see that academies and maintained schools are listed as eligible for the split site under the new criteria. but they aren't generating any funding. This approach now works in the same way as any of the other pupil-led factors. You need to put a unit cost in the pro forma. So use cell G50 of the pro forma tab to put a basic eligibility unit cost in, and use cell I50 to put a distance funding rate in, and then dependent on the eligibility that each school has, they will be allocated split site funding. If you don't put values in the pro forma tab, you will not get any split site funding generated, even if you have schools eligible. Okay. You can make changes, but again, you will need a disapplication to do so. So if a school's gained an extra site or opened on an additional site after the summer of 2024 and they are not listed on the APT, you can provide them with some funding, but you need our permission to list it. Okay, so you'll need a disapplication. Similarly, a school may have ceased operating on one of their sites and are no longer eligible. Again, you need to let us know. We will give you permission to change that data. Okay. NNDR, the national non-domestic rates. We have provided a tab on the APT that shows you the amount that is provided in the NFF for NNDR. There are two columns, one that is the total value of the bill and one that was any adjustments from the previous year. Okay, simply reflect the first of those columns into column AC of the local factors tab on the APT. Do not reflect any recent or expected conversions. We need the value listed that we have provided you in the NFF settlement. Okay. You then can list what you expect the 25-26 value to be on the LA estimate of NNDR 25-26 tab. Okay. So do not list 25-26 actuals on the local factors. You list those on that tab a bit further along. Okay. We will use them to QA where appropriate, where billing authorities are now claiming through a central mechanism, and they will also inform the 2026-2027 NFF settlement. So do make sure that you've requested those from colleagues who work on the business rates area, so that you can populate that tab accurately as you can. There is a column on the local factors, column AD, which is headlined adjustments for 2025-26. We would only expect an entry in that column if it is an LA maintained school and you and or your billing authorities are still operating under the old mechanism for payment as of the 31st of March this year. Okay. So if you are operating on the central mechanism whereby billing authorities submit a claim for NNDR directly to ESFA, we would not expect column AD to be populated at all. Okay. So a quick table to summarize. If you're in the new mechanism, column AD should not be populated for anybody. And if you're on the old mechanism, then you may provide values in column AD for your LA maintained schools only. Okay, so no academies should have a value in column AD at any point. Okay, because that will be handled through the central payment mechanism anyway. Now, there are some schools that close, and so you cannot, and aren't listed on the local factors sheet, so you cannot show the NNDR value that we have provided in the NFF. I will cover how to deal with that in a minute. Schools that become an academy, you should be able to provide the NNDR value for the academy as was shown for the LA maintained school previously. Okay, but where a school has ceased to operate, there is a mechanism that you can account for that, given that we will be recouping that from you at the NFF value. So I shall come to that in a minute. Another area that we have regular communication at this point with LAs about is around the growth fund. We have tightened up in terms of the categories that are expected to be seen in the criteria on that growth and falling roll sheet this year. So there are lots of yes and no drop downs to start with. If you have increased pupil numbers for any provider on the inputs and adjustments worksheet, then cell D5 on the growth and falling roll sheet must say yes, because you are paying implicit growth. If you are showing a separate growth fund on the proforma tab, then cell D6 must show yes, because you are operating an explicit growth fund. Okay. And we would then also expect there to be entries in columns D10 to D14 to show that you are meeting minimum criteria, minimum expectations around the rate of funding per pupil, and how many of the criteria you are going to run, you will state in the boxes available. If you are requesting schools and academies to take on an additional class, whether there is spare capacity or not, you must fund that additional class. Okay, so if you require a school or an academy to take on an additional class, even if they're operating currently below the pan, they must be eligible for basic need growth funding. Okay. And on falling rolls, reference to the school capacity survey data will be needed. And obviously where that data is suggesting that places will be needed in the 3 to 5 year window, then that is a criteria. And any other criteria you have, you should list on the falling rolls section of that worksheet. The block transfers sheet allows us to monitor how the overall spend and transfers between blocks is operating in your local authority. Okay, so it shows where you've transferred out to CSSB, early years, or the high needs block, and indeed where you have brought money in from other blocks or potentially from reserves, so that we can ensure that what you have allocated is not a significant under or overspend compared to the income through the DSG schools block plus any other transfers in. Okay. If you are making transfers in or out, then please provide some text for explaining that. However small the transfer is, we do need some explanatory text. Where it's a transfer to another block out of the schools block, we'd like evidence to the schools forum decision approving that. If you have a disapplication, then reference the disapplication. The decisions for those disapplications will follow in due course. But this ensures that we can see that your spend is matching up to the allocation as provided through the formula. There is also the ability here to balance off the NNDR for any closing schools. There is a cell that will highlight here. So if you have a school that's closed, that NNDR money will still be brought back to the central pot. Okay, it does not stay with the local authorities. So to ensure that you don't allocate that unintentionally, if you have a school or schools and academies that have closed and aren't operating, then the NNDR value needs to be put into that cell on the block transfer sheet, and that means that then it will be allocated, accounted for appropriately, so that you don't unintentionally allocate it. Okay, because we will be clawing it back. The recoupment tab. This shows the values that we will recoup as ESFA from your DSG payments using the formula that you have set up in the APT. Okay, so LAs, as I've mentioned, are already responsible for funding basic need growth, whether that is to an LA maintained school or to an academy. If you have made basic need growth payments to an academy, you should record those on the recoupment tab. There's two columns in the middle of that tab that are light blue, and they allow you to show how much money has been paid in basic need growth for the period September to March, so September 24 to March 25 in this case, and separately the payments made between April 25 and August 25 as expected when you submit the APT. Okay, the September to March figure, we will deduct from any academies that ESFA are funding in year. So it may be that they have an arrangement with us that we will fund them for the in-year census rather than the lag census. But because some of that growth in pupils may be basic need, we account for the cash value that you have paid them before we pay any more growth. So that avoids double funding. Okay. However, the April to August payment, we recognize that the reason that you are paying this is because the school has become an academy or is operating as an academy, and their financial year runs on an extra lag compared to the maintained sector. So you should pay the academy the basic need funding for the period April to August. But if you list it in that column on the APT, you will have that money returned because we reduce the amount we will recoup from you for that school by that growth factor amount. So if you have paid a school £75,000 in basic need growth for the period April to August 2025, the recoupment for that school will be reduced by £75,000, so you get it back. Okay. The LAs are responsible for paying it, but we recognise that there is an extra lag for academies. They are entitled to that money, but because the formula doesn't uplift for them until later, they need that money, but ESFA will meet that cost by giving you that back through a reduced recoupment. Okay, so make sure the April to August column is accurately completed and that there is a comment next to it as well. And then the growth will be paid by you, but returned to you by us. Political ratification dates. You must distribute your allocations to your LA maintained schools by the end of February. So just consider if your sign off is after the 21st of February, have you enough time if there are any changes to the formula after that point that need additional sign off? Have you the time to get it signed off? If your sign off is around is actually the date you're thinking is the date that the council approve all budgets, then you probably have got, for example, your section 151 or chief financial officer has given approval for your school funding allocations already. Okay, therefore you could provide us with that date rather than the final date for the full council account sign off. Okay, but have a look at school forum dates. Are they quite late in February? What happens if we come back to you and say that doesn't comply and you need to make a change? Have you time to do that, given you have to issue school budgets by the 28th of February? And any date you provide in into March, that is too late. We will expect that you will have issued those allocations to your schools before that sign off. Okay, so the risk is then yours if that date for political ratification is later than the 28th of February. Okay. So it's just some simple validation check reminders. So what happens here is that we will run some checks on your APT. And if these checks are failed, we may well send the APT back to you without doing any more checking because we are not sure that this is a final version of the APT. Not unreasonably, you will have pulled some data in from elsewhere on your internal network. You'll have done some work and some modelling, and you know the NNDR figures, or you've got a list of your PFI score values, etc. So by all means, have a version of your APT that has links to those files in it. But before you submit one to ESFA, save a new version, then break the links, then resave it, and then send it to us. Okay? So any APTs that have got links to other files, we are likely to send it back and ask you to break the links before you and then resubmit, and then we will have a look at it. Okay, this is because we are not sure that the final values that are being shown were refreshed before you submitted it, so we don't know that they are your final versions. Okay. The validation sheet is the sheet on the very right hand side, final tab. If you have any red flags on it, we will ask you to address and resolve those before we will consider it. So once you think you've finished, have a look at the validation and check there's no red flags. If there are some red flags, then you can hover over the descriptor next to the fail flag, and that will tell you what is causing the fail on which tab, and potentially you'll be able to highlight which schools are causing the issue. Most common are that you've made an adjustment. You may have added an exceptional circumstance or a change to the baseline or something of that ilk, and haven't put a comment either on the commentary tab or in the comment section on that specific worksheet that gives you the chance to give a bit more detail about what you've done and why. Okay, so it may just need to be the disapplication number, or it may be a quick explanation about the joint use for that school or schools that's attracting the extra money. But if you are putting additional monies in, then we do need a comment adding, and often that is the cause of the failure on the validation sheet. One of those two are missing. Okay, so do have a look at that. Make sure that any school that you expect to open as a free school in the mainstream sector for pre-16 that are expected to open in the financial year, you have listed them. We have provided you with a list for any schools we think in your LA are opening, so we would expect them to be there unless you have had final confirmation that that project is on hold. Okay, if you have that, that's fine. If you are not sure or you expect it to open as a new free school, then do make sure it is listed on the inputs and adjustments, and therefore it is budgeted for. We will be recouping for these schools. So if you haven't budgeted for it, then you would need to restate your formula. But if you have budgeted for it and then it doesn't open, then we won't recoup that money and the money will stay with you. That is a much easier situation to navigate than if you haven't included it and the school does open. Okay. Have a quick look on the final baselines tab at the end column that the pounds per pupil look reasonable. So you haven't got some very high or very low entries. If you have any what you would think to be very high or very low entries, and you haven't made an adjustment to the baseline tab, then no problem. That is what the baseline is. If you have made some adjustments to the baseline and you have some very high or very low rates per pupil at the end column, then do check that those numbers are correct, that the cash values and the number of pupils are for the right amount of time and comparable amount of time. So if a school is open for 7 months, have you put a full year of pupils and a part year allocation, or the other way around? Because you may then have a too high or too low MFG rate for the following year. Okay, so just have a look at that. If you have questions after this session, please do submit them to the APT submissions.questions mailbox. And there are several of us that have access to that mailbox, and we will either deal with your question as soon as we possibly can or pass it on to a colleague. It may require some input from policy or NFF calculation colleagues, but we will deal with it as soon as we possibly can. Clearly, it's a busy time and we'll have lots of questions at that point, but we will come to them and get back to you as soon as we possibly can.